History of periodicity. It all started with a thirsty woman looking for a young man. Her name was Proton. She looked all around the universe to find him, and at last she succeeded. Electron was his name. From their union and all the weird stuff that came with it, all other elements were created. Now, in their honor, in the atomic world, all the women of Proton's age are called protons, and all the young men are called electrons. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a bunch of femmes d'un certain âge, also called protons, reunited in order to look for young men in order to be friends, let's say. And they had a great and glorious idea: create paradise in the universe, a place where to eat grapes and drink wine for all eternity, a male harem. After being together for a time of like a millisecond, these women realized that they could not stand each other. So they tried creating a harem, each for themselves. Many who did not succeed decided to put aside their differences and work together. But after not one, not 3, but 2 milliseconds, they realized that they really could not stand each other. So they decided to look for someone who could help them stay together, and they did. It was a bunch of old Buddhist monks, also called neutrons. With their help, the protons were able of collaborating in order to attract young men to their harem, and at the end, they succeeded. But there were still some things the protons had to take into account, some good, some less. For example, the more the women, the closer the young men, since through collaboration, the protons were able of finding new ways of attracting them, and the smaller the building of the harem had to be, smaller atomic ionic radius. But it's also true that those young men had to stay somewhere, so the more the men, the bigger the harem, obviously. But the harem was built in a circular way, with buildings that surrounded the main building of the protons, layer-wise. And the thing was that the electrons that lived in the outer building got less attention from the women, so they got less attracted. The less attracted the young men were to the harem, the more they were intentioned to go to other harems, or the easier it was for protons from other harems to get them, since many were always on the hunt of new young men. And the general rule was that the less roommates these young men had in their structure, the easier it was that they'd leave. The easiness with which electrons leave is also called ionization energy, which is very linked to electron affinity, aka the ability of women of getting young men. Let me explain. If a group of women only had one young man in the outer building, they'd be sorry for him, and in most cases, they'd prefer letting him go than bear all the stress of the probability that he'd leave anyways because he'd feel lonely. On the other hand, the more young men a bunch of women already had in the outer building, the more confident they were and the more they wanted to fill the outer building. They all wanted to imitate the group 18s. Because, there was a group of protons that were silently admired by all others. Because of their ability to get electrons, they were called noble gases. Absolutely all of their buildings were full, and the young men of those harems were so satisfied that they were very reluctant on living. The noble gases did not follow the rules of electron affinity as the others did, but they had their own community in which they applied the electroaffinity rules using the same principle that all the others followed, just without mixing with them. And then there were some harems in which the Buddhist ideals had such an impact that the protons of more than one harem built a bridge between them, in which some of the outer electrons were transferred. For example, if the building of two harems only lacked one electron to become noble gases, one electron from each harem will go and leave the bridge and live in the bridge building, which effectively meant that they lived in both harems. The young men were happy because they got to have as many fellas as they could, and the women were happy because they counted themselves as noble gases. This ability to share electrons is also called electronegativity. And in 8 minutes it's gonna be 1 o'clock in the morning.
It's a good night. No, actually.